Good evening, Mr. Wilcox. What you're looking at are details and records outlining the history of the museum's GAZ-67B. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to present these facts and stories to the museum's YouTube audience over a time period of exactly 13 minutes and 37 seconds. Should you state any inaccuracies, or if your pronunciation is criticized by commenters, the museum will disavow any knowledge of your actions. This message will self-destruct in 5 seconds. Good luck.
What is a GAZ Jeep? In order to understand where this vehicle came from, we have to wind the clocks back just a little bit to the end of the Bolshevik Revolution in the Soviet Union. It's at this point where the Soviets are struggling to industrialize, and rather than create their own vehicles from the ground up, which was honestly hard when the majority of their population was illiterate to begin with, they decided to start turning to other Western corporations to give them vehicle designs that they could later Sovietize, that is, change them into more rugged and perhaps more primitive vehicles to work in the very harsh conditions of the pre-industrial Soviet Union. One of the companies they turned to was right here in the United States. It was the Ford Motor Company, who, under contract, would later build a factory in the Soviet city of Gorky, northeast of Moscow. This factory, which would later become the first GAZ Motor Company factory in the Soviet Union, initially produced Ford Model A's and Ford Model MA's, for example, the Ford truck. The Soviets immediately began editing these designs, creating the GAZ A through AAA, so the A, AA, AAA, all three of which were essentially just slightly tweaked versions of those American vehicles I talked about. And we can actually see that Ford influence still in even vehicles like this GAZ Jeep that you see behind me, as we'll later get to the structure of its engine and also the logo on the vehicle itself, which is very similar to that early Ford logo, right down to the oval shape, which has creatively turned a Russian G into looking very much like an American F. In June of 1941, the German army invades the Soviet Union. It's at this point that the Gorky GAZ factory suddenly receives an order from Soviet command that they must start building essentially a copy of the American quarter-ton truck, what we now know as the Jeep. Now, the Gorky Corporation had a lot of different American designs to work from, everything from the Ford Motor Company designs that were very well known to also the Willys designs and the lesser-known Bantam designs as well. In the end, they decided to go with that Ford design, creating the first version of the GAZ Jeep, the GAZ-64. But because of the nature of the war and because of the speed of the German advance, the Soviets didn't even have time to test the prototypes of the GAZ-64, which resulted in it becoming an incredibly flawed vehicle. They're rolling these out as fast as they can from the Gorky factory, and the moment that they hit the front lines, they began falling apart. So the Soviets took the time with the second version of it, the GAZ-67, which of course is technically what we have here, although this is a GAZ-67B. The GAZ-67 initially began by using that rip-off Ford Model A engine that I'd kind of alluded to earlier. It's just a straight four-cylinder engine that actually can get the Jeep up to a speed of around 57 miles per hour, which is pretty impressive. The vehicle also had some technological problems, which were later improved on in the GAZ-67B model, which allowed it to not only drive only using the front-wheel drive rather than always being stuck in four-wheel drive, but also gave the vehicle an improved gearbox for an easier time shifting and larger radiator, which overall contributed to the better cross-country performance of the 67B model. Both the 67 and the 67B were produced until the end of World War II, and in the case of the 67B, it was produced even beyond that war. The 67B was produced from 1943 to 1953, which reasonably means this vehicle could in fact be Soviet World War II era surplus. Now, this is technically guessing. We don't actually know exactly when or even where this particular Jeep was constructed, but considering that the Gorky factory was the only one, which reasonably means this vehicle here could in fact be Soviet military surplus from World War II. And I say this as an educated guess because this vehicle ended up in the Korean War, as did much of Soviet World War II era surplus following the end of the war in Europe. Well, the story of our GAZ probably began in a factory in the Soviet Union. Its documented history began in 1950 in the midst of the Korean War. I'll remind our viewers very briefly that the Korean War was not necessarily just an American endeavor. It was a UN coalition working together to fight the North Korean military and then later the Chinese. And one of the members of that UN coalition, alongside the United States, were Australian units, in particular the 3rd Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment, or 3RAR, which is how I'll refer to it in the rest of the video. Now, the 3RAR found itself in North Korea in 1950, just at the cusp of the Chinese first phase offensive at what became known as the Battle of Pakchan. And it would be at the Battle of Pakchan that a significant event occurred, an event that would lead the Australians to get their hands on the very Jeep I'm seated in now. We actually have the documentation from this battle here, although this is in fact just a blown-up photocopy of the original documents that was actually built as a display item that again came with the Jeep when it was acquired by the museum. It details a confrontation on the 26th of October of 1950 where the three RAR found themselves pitted against units of the North Korean military. In particular, this group consisted of a large force of infantry combined with two T-34 tanks, ironically one is just ahead of us here in this exhibit, and a few Jeeps, one of which was the very one I'm seated in now. As the battle begins to ensue, the three RAR initially engages different sections of this North Korean patrol or perhaps simple assault, and initially the North Koreans take heavy casualties. It actually states right here in this battle report that the excitement of the event was so exhilarating that when the Australians raised their bazookas to fire at these approaching T-34s, all of them misfired because the men had not actually turned off the safeties in the haste that they were to start firing at enemy vehicles. The battle ends up going the way of the Australians, and they take very few casualties while the North Koreans completely retreat and leave behind all of the vehicles, the most of which had been either destroyed or disabled. One of those vehicles that had been disabled was the very Jeep I'm seated in now. This GAZ-67B had taken rounds from an Australian 50 caliber machine gun. One of those rounds entered the back end of the vehicle, which we still have lit up to this day. You can see the hole where it was patched over, and it actually entered through the seat that I'm sitting in and in fact killed a North Korean colonel who was sitting here. Now, this North Korean colonel, upon dying, also had with him a large amount of enemy documents which fell into the hands of the Royal Australian Regiment, and they used these documents to great effect as they began fighting elsewhere here in the Pakchan area in North Korea. After the three RAR captured this Jeep, it was in fact repaired and then later driven by one Private Butch McHenry, who's actually pictured in this photo here that we have in the museum and also in the collection that came with this Jeep, initially repairing the vehicle and then of course driving it around. It is assumed that this Jeep probably just operated as captured equipment until the end of the Korean War, and it didn't do anything particularly special, just kind of serving along the Australians and giving them a comfortable ride across this snowy terrain. As an additional piece of proof that we have here at the museum that tells us that this vehicle is verifiably the one that was not only shot at but also captured and used by the three RAR during the Korean War, we have this document here, which is in fact a photocopy of correspondence between the captain of the three RAR come the 1980s, one J.B. Bale, and also the later owner of this vehicle in Australia, a Mr. Wheeler, who we'll get to later. It was after the Korean War that this Jeep arrived at the Trials and Proving Wing at a military base in Monagita, Australia. It was here, just north of Victoria, that it was supposed to be tested against a variety of other American Jeeps of a similar design to this. There's no actual record of this testing existing, and the vehicle itself just kind of languished at this military base for a number of years until it was eventually sold at a military surplus auction, we assume sometime in the early 1960s. It was spotted at a disposal yard also in Monagita in 1960, a place known as Hughes Disposals, where the vehicle itself was still in relatively good condition. Many at the time simply referred to it as the, quote, funny commie Jeep and came to see it as kind of a half-tourist attraction for a time before it suddenly disappeared from the salvage yard. It's at this point in 1964 that the GAZ finally enters private ownership. It was purchased from that salvage yard by a family in Mernda, Australia, who kept it in their backyard for a number of years where it unfortunately continued to deteriorate. It wasn't until 1972 that a man by the name of W.F. Wheeler, the foremost owner of this vehicle, finally saw it sitting in that backyard and decided immediately he wanted to purchase and restore this GAZ. It wouldn't be until 1980, 8 years after Wheeler had originally seen the vehicle, that he finally would gain enough capital to fully purchase it. But by that point, it had deteriorated even further, and so the lengthy restoration process that would become the major history of this vehicle had to begin. It's thanks to Mr. Wheeler that we have this massive document that really served as the primary source for this video. Inside this folder, scrapbook of sorts, Wheeler documented absolutely everything he could find about not only GAZ Jeeps in general, but also about this particular GAZ and its history. He did everything from interviewing veterans who worked alongside this vehicle to tracking down original documents to help in the restoration. In fact, when he was trying to figure out how to put this vehicle back together, to turn it from rusted hulk into the magnificent vehicle we see today, he actually reached out to the Russian Motor Export Corporation and asked them for spare parts. Unfortunately, they had none to spare, but Wheeler found two associates there who in fact were sympathetic to his cause to restore this vehicle into what we see it today. They sent him a copy of the original technical documents that would normally go with a GAZ-67B Jeep, and they came almost directly from the libraries that held such documents in Moscow. But they couldn't just send him the original book. All of it came on microfilm, 200 pages of it, and all of it was in Russian. So Wheeler had to take the microfilm and then print it out and place it in a folder such as this one that we have here. This is one of many different variants, by the way. But you can see it's all the original technical documentation for the vehicle itself. Wheeler went all around the world searching for pieces to restore his GAZ. He found them in places like Indonesia, America, South America, and also in the garages and storage bins of his friends in the Victorian Military Vehicle Corps, which is essentially a vehicle restoration club in Victoria, Australia. Using those parts, he was able to restore the GAZ into an immaculate condition, to the point where it became, as far as he was concerned, the only running GAZ in the entirety of Australia, perhaps the only GAZ there at all, and in fact made appearances in Australian magazines like this one for off-road vehicles, where it has a very nice spread right here in the back of the magazine. It still remains in its near running capability today. We could consider it operable even as it sits right here inside the museum. This vehicle also ended up working a lot in film and television. Our GAZ's first appearance on television would be a part of a TV miniseries filmed specifically in Australia. It was called The Far Country, and it was filmed in September of 1985. It was the story of two people outrunning their dark pasts in World War II Europe and ending up in Australia. Our GAZ in particular appeared in a flashback scene in what I can only assume to be the Battle of Berlin as Soviets advanced down a ruined street. Unfortunately, all we have are photos of this occurring during the actual shoot, but maybe some commenters who had actually seen this series way back in the day could actually tell me exactly where this Jeep showed up. Probably the most significant television appearance of our GAZ, however, would be in Season 2, Episode 6 of the legendary television series Mission Impossible. The episode, titled War Games, features our Jeep in the introduction sequence. It's driving down a road, being shot at by rockets, and is apparently destroyed. Completely exploded, it flips over and is burning on the side of the road. But throughout the episode, the Jeep is continually used by members of the main cast and the antagonists in the episode. It's even at one point hot-wired to make a daring escape towards the end. We have the documentation that tells us the Jeep was used in a shoot that was conducted on September 21st, 1989. We not only have the specific scenes it was listed in, but we also have documentation that told Wheeler where to take the Jeep so it could be used on set, which is pretty cool. We actually have a copy of the pay stub from Paramount given to Wheeler to pay for his Jeep's appearance on camera. It was apparently $1,000, although we don't know if it was United States or Australian dollars. Sadly, the pay stub doesn't indicate which. Unfortunately, after Mission Impossible, this is where the paper trail actually kind of comes to an end. We don't really know what happened with this Jeep from the late 1980s all the way up until 2020 when it was privately acquired by our museum. When our owner purchased this vehicle, he originally envisioned it here in the Korean War exhibit, mainly because of the story he had heard about that bullet hole going through the back end of the passenger seat and killing that Korean colonel. Perhaps the documentation that came alongside our GAZ is rarer than the vehicle itself. Here at the museum, we have very few vehicles that possess this detailed of a pedigree, a history, both in war and also out of war as well, which for me at least elevates this GAZ from something that is perhaps a little bit mundane into something much more interesting. Needless to say, its history both on the battlefield in reality and in fiction has made this GAZ a kind of hidden gem within our collection here at the National Museum of Military Vehicles. But we'd like to know what you think. Have you perhaps seen this vehicle in a parade somewhere in Australia or in a private collection that maybe I didn't cover in this video? If there's any additional history you can provide about our GAZ here in the museum, feel free to offer it up in the comments. And speaking of comments, feel free to leave one telling us what vehicle you'd like to see done next here on the channel. But as always, I'm Hank Wilcox, and thanks for watching. You may be thinking that for a guy like me, driving a car this old is an impossible task. But thankfully, in Soviet Russia, cars drive you. But if you're looking for something that's less communist and a bit more capitalist, you can always go with this black sweater, which I've been wearing for the entirety of the video. It does, in fact, feature an American Jeep, both on the front and on the rear, and yes, we did that on purpose. But to quote Henry Ford, you can buy any color you want as long as it's in black. Link in the description below.